Good evening, everyone. It's 7 o'clock, so I'd love to get started. My name is Bethany Yeiser. I'm president of the Cures Foundation, which stands for Comprehensive Understanding via Research and Education into Schizophrenia. Tonight is being sponsored by Cures on Campus Clubs. If you like what you hear tonight, I hope you'll contact me and get more information about how you can get involved in our clubs. So tonight we're going to talk about a plant that is widely regarded as safe. Perhaps everybody does it. Dr. Mesamore is going to give us some hard science behind the risks. I also would ask at this time, please make sure you mute yourself so we can hear Dr. Mesamore, and I'd love to introduce him at this time. He is a psychiatric physician, pharmacologist, university professor, and solution-focused scholar. Recognized authority in the field of psychiatric medicine, he believes in moving useful mental health information out of library textbooks or academic journals and into the hands of the people who need it. He is a seasoned clinician, accomplished scientist, and has a passion for improving the lives of those affected by mental illness. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Mesamore.
So thanks, Bethany, for inviting me to speak to your group about mental health risks of marijuana. As you mentioned, I'm a practicing psychiatrist. I see lots of different kinds of people with lots of different kinds of conditions. And amongst the things that I am a specialist in is in disorders that involve the symptom of psychosis. And in my practice, which actually began in marijuana-friendly Portland, Oregon, I noticed a number of people in my practice who seemed to be having some difficulties, like psychiatric symptoms that were related to the cannabis use. And I also noticed that in some of my hospital patients, the ones that were the most ill and the ones who I could help the least, unfortunately, had all in common the history of adolescent onset, multi-use, and relatively heavy cannabis use. So I got to be very interested in questions about whether, to what extent that marijuana might produce negative psychiatric syndromes, and started to speak publicly about it after I read extensively and came to some conclusions based on science and in my practice. And since I started to speak in public about cannabis risks, I got a lot of feedback from people, various kinds of people representing various kinds of interests. And based upon all this feedback, I want to make the following points very clear. I'm not on the payroll of any prohibition or anti-cannabis lobby. I'm obviously not on the payroll of any pro-cannabis interests. I do this without compensation simply because, as a psychiatrist, I've seen a lot of people learn about cannabis risks the hard way, which is by personal experience. And I just think it's worthwhile if we're going to live with legal marijuana, which personally I believe we should. We're going to have to, as a society, understand that it comes with its risks, just like everything else. And which gets me to the third bullet point, that I've learned that when I say things about cannabis that suggest that there could be certain risks, people believe that I am trying to promote fear to make it illegal or continue prohibition. And I personally think that prohibition has been a very bad policy over the last 80 years. And I believe, as I say, that any informed adult in a truly free society ought to be able to exercise their own choices when it comes to using cannabis or not. But again, if we're going to have it as legal as cigarettes or alcohol, its risks need to be equally well known. And finally, I'm speaking as my own person. I am employed by a university, but my opinions and statements do not reflect those of my employer. The main points I'm going to make this evening are here as follows. Cannabis affects the function of a variety of important chemicals that the brain cells use to communicate with each other and use in the ordinary functioning of brain information processing. Cannabis is able to attach to cells in many different regions of the brain, and those different regions serve different functions. So the combination of multiple chemical effects with multiple brain regions that are affected leads to the possibility for a lot of potential therapeutic benefit and the potential for a lot of potentially difficult and painful risks. A very important point that I don't think is widely understood, but I think is worth understanding very clearly, is that when it comes to medicines, we use medicines to try to get some benefit. In classical medicinal therapeutics, we want our medicines to reduce the symptoms of illness. In recreational drug use, we want the drug to produce some sort of elevation of mood or interesting subjective effects. And we'll call those benefits as well. But you cannot ever separate benefit from risk, because generally speaking, the things about a drug that give it its potential for benefit are exactly the same thing that create the possibility for risk. Drugs are chemicals that perturb living systems, and when we perturb them in ways that fight disease processes, they are therapeutic. But some people just react very badly to having their systems perturbed by chemicals, and that will result in some people having some harm. And as I'll point out in this slide set, the way that cannabis interacts with brain chemistry has a lot of very important intersection with the biochemistry of various kinds of psychiatric symptoms or mental illnesses. So it's to be expected that cannabis is going to produce some difficulties for some people. And I am, again, very thankful to Bethany for inviting me, and I'm very thankful for your interest in this topic, because this is a very important topic in my view. As you all know, we're in the process of changing 80 plus years of policy around marijuana in this country, and the process is similarly underway in many other countries across the globe. In the United States, the major driving force for this episode of cannabis reform has been the concept of medical marijuana. Most states which have liberalized marijuana policy have done through the recognition, the official government state recognition of marijuana as a medicine. And that leads automatically to consumers viewing it as medicine. And medicine we tend to think is helpful and not as particularly harmful. There are also the concept of recreational cannabis, and we think of recreation as fun and not harmful. And the advocates, lobbyists, and supporters of policy reform have broadly really highlighted the possible benefits and really underestimated or downplayed, or sometimes actually just misrepresented, the risk side of the equation. That makes sense, because if I'm a lobbyist trying to get a state legislator to vote in favor of policy reform, and if I'm asked, isn't it true that marijuana could send some people to the hospital with like really bad panic attacks? If I admit that, it's going to be, a pretty big strike against changing the mind of the legislator to vote. So it's obviously in the interest of advocates to downplay the risks. And there's actually not a requirement that they do. I mean, if you're a lobbyist, you're hired to highlight the benefits and downplay the risks. And also, unlike for tobacco or alcohol or any other medicine, which is legally required to display warnings, there is no such requirement for marijuana products, or to the extent that they do require warnings, they're actually really, really, really vague. So the overall picture is that the risks are not all that serious. And one of the best characterized and potentially most serious possible risks of cannabis is the production of the symptom called psychosis. But here's an example of industry advocates at work. This is a lady named Morgan Fox. She gave an interview actually to a Cincinnati-based television station, and quoting, "There is zero proof that cannabis consumption causes psychosis," which is absolutely not true. To give Morgan Fox the benefit of the doubt, she just might know about the 150 years of data that say pretty clearly that there's a link between cannabis consumption and the causation of psychosis in at least some groups. And as an aside, this current concept we have of medical marijuana is actually medical marijuana 2.0 in the United States. We had marijuana 1.0, the OG medical marijuana in the United States in the 19th century. So from mid 1800s to early 1900s, marijuana was just another medicine. Every medical textbook listed marijuana as a potential treatment. They listed the diseases that marijuana might be useful for, and they're actually very similar to the diseases that it's useful for, that's recognized today as useful for. But of course, typical of doctors, we also understand that treatments have risks. And in those textbooks from the 1850s and the 1880s and the 1910s, there are paragraphs that describe risks from marijuana, including it wasn't called psychosis, frankly, but the symptoms are quite obvious. And laboratory evidence is, I mean, there's abundant evidence. So Ms. Fox, if you're listening, I hope you'll pay attention to the rest and perhaps think more carefully about statements like this in the future. Another reason why what I'm getting at here is that there is a pervasive underestimation of the possibility for harm. Another plank in that underestimation comes from that thing where the states are calling it medicine. I put this slide together a year and a half ago, so some more states have been added. But from 2 years ago, these are all the states in the United States that have created medical marijuana laws. And on this y-axis, you see the number of what are called qualifying medical conditions, which the average consumer is going to interpret as diseases that are treatable by marijuana. And so you see down here, the District of Columbia listed 8, Maryland listed 9, but the very optimistic, my home state of Illinois, very optimistic, listed 40, and my current home state, Ohio, lists 21. So, you know, 10, 20, 40 diseases that state governments have officially endorsed as treatable by marijuana. And every one of these states has a website that describes their marijuana program and lists the conditions that it can treat. These are the same states, and these are the number of potential risks that they list, that they describe to the general public. So most of the states are completely silent on the cannabis risk. Many of the states actually have instructions for how kids, minors, people under the age of 18 can acquire medical marijuana cards. So the average consumer is going to get the idea it's very beneficial. I can even use it for kids. And they're not going to get a really clear picture of the risk profile that science actually knows about. Altogether, this leads to somewhat old, 4 years old now. 1/3 of US adults think that smoking or vaping actually is healthful, not just harmless, but actually boosts health quality. Half of adults say that cannabis has 0 potentially serious side effects. And from I think the very concerning data, 2/3 of adolescents or young adults have 0 concern about cannabis potentially causing difficulties for their health. The alarming thing is that one of the things that cannabis does is it interacts with a neurochemical called glutamate, which is critically important for brain development. And in this age group of 16 to 19, the brain is undergoing massive development. So this age group is actually particularly at risk for a whole variety of potential harms. But thanks to Morgan Fox and thanks to the strong messaging about natural medicine, most people are oblivious to the possible concerns. And as I said, as a psychiatrist, I actually didn't know about it because we don't teach this to medical students. We still don't. They certainly didn't teach a whole lot about cannabis benefits and harms when I was in medical school. Most doctors, or like most people, the general public, are just not informed. So underestimation of risk is widespread. So if you want to get to the question of what are the risks, the potential risks of cannabis, one great way to do it is just talk to consumers, people who use it, and you can say, have you ever had X, Y, or Z in terms of possible side effects or risks? And I'll show you a couple of studies. One is a study and one's a survey of studies. This is a study that was done in 1996. Important to highlight 1996 because in that era, most cannabis was just plant-based material. THC content was probably 4%, maybe 6% on average. It was a different ballgame in terms of potency. But back in those days, in a single town in New Zealand, researchers went door to door and delivered 1,000 surveys to 1,000 individuals. Half responded to the survey, and of the half that responded, 38% reported, yeah, I've used weed at least one time in my life. So from the ones that reported that they had used cannabis, they gave them a questionnaire about, has this ever happened to you? Has that ever happened to you? So straight from the mouth of actual consumers, 1 in 3 were reporting difficulties controlling their cannabis use. Dependence, addiction, substance use disorder, different ways to phrase it, but the overall concept is they found it difficult to regulate their use. They thought that they were using it too much and had difficulty stopping. 1 in 3 adults in a community. Panic attacks, 1 in 5 had reported that they'd experienced a panic attack. 15% said that they experienced psychosis, and its question comes up. So psychosis was literally defined here. Have you ever had strange, unpleasant experiences, such as hearing voices or becoming convinced that someone's trying to harm you or that you're being persecuted? So that was the definition of psychosis, yes or no. And 15% of people who ever used cannabis said that happened to them. And then 12%, just over 1 in 10 consumers said that it had negatively impacted their physical health in some way. So that's the data. And basically it has some risks, and 1 in 3 deal with issues of self-control. 1 in 5 deal with severe anxiety. 15%, which don't ask me to quote the 1 in X, but 15% is the number of people reporting psychosis, and nearly 1 in 10 with health problems. Here's an analysis of numerous studies. So Green, Kavanaugh, and Young in 2003 published a paper, and they simply looked at all the reports that were similar to this one, in which they look at consumers and did surveys about benefits or risks. So in all of the studies that were analyzed by Green and colleagues, they are looking at about 3,000 consumers. And from one of the tables in that report, here are the data. So over half say that it makes them less social. Over half say that they have concentration problems. About half report that they've experienced, a paranoia. Had memory problems, had anxiety, had difficulty thinking, had sleep disturbance, had depressed mood or hallucinations, 1 in 5, or irritability, just under 1 in 10. So bottom line is that it doesn't work for everybody, and side effects are pretty common. I did my own survey 2 years ago. And it's not, it's like 223 demographically representative and randomly selected adults. But one of the questions I asked is, have you ever used cannabis? And if you did, was it just one time, just a few times, or often? And of the cannabis users, 18% only did one time, and 76% used it once or just a few times. I think this is significant because it doesn't exactly get at side effects, but certainly if it was not an experience that 1 in 5 people found worth repeating, and that 3/4 of people found worth doing on a regular basis. So it suggests that for the average consumer, the experience is not enough to drive regular consumption. And this comes to an interesting point, because if you listen to advocates like on social media, then we're looking at largely this 20% of the population for whom it works exceptionally well. There are people who've had horrible experiences, and there are people who've had fabulous experiences. And they, want to be able to use it legally without fear of incarceration and all that stuff. And they're going to be very vocal in saying things like, nothing bad ever happened to me. They'll say things like, people have been using cannabis for 5,000 years, and if it did anything seriously harmful, we know about it by now. And they put out, I mean, those are the ones that are driving a lot of the conversation, which is skewed excessively toward optimism. The folks who have had an experience of psychosis or of cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, which is a problem of continuous vomiting to the point that it can be extremely uncomfortable and occasionally life-threatening. Those folks generally don't go public with their experiences. So the public perception is a bit skewed toward positive experience. And again, I mean, I'm happy that people, I'm happy with the people for whom it works really well, and I wish them nothing but the best and continued success. But I just think that if we're going to live with this open in society, we need to also understand that it's going to do bad things for some people. So this gets to a point that, we have the conversation is skewed or a bit dominated by the people for whom it works exceptionally well. Certainly it is influenced by folks like Morgan Fox up here and cannabis industry interests who want to make it legal and want to make a lot of money by selling it on the open market. So there's some bias in that message. So who are you going to listen to? We can listen to the consumers. These guys didn't have any skin in the game. They just were reporting, but they were volunteering the information. So these numbers, I think we can give some credence to them. And then maybe we should look at what scientists say who are not attached to lobbying organizations, who are not like in favor of prohibition or in favor or stand to make any money from legalization. And we have a report, a pretty good report from a very respected organization called National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. This was founded by the United States Congress to advise Congress on complicated problems in the areas of science, engineering, or medicine. It's been around, the National Academies has been around for a really long time. And they were commissioned by a number of stakeholders, including the governments of some recreationally legal cannabis states, like the state of Oregon and Washington. They paid for the analysis as well. But they said, please just do a comprehensive survey and advise us about the health effects, pro or con, of cannabis and related compounds. So the National Academies did their job. They looked at, initially, they screened over 10,000 scientific studies and tried to extract the ones that had relevant information and then summarize all that. They published a report 2017. This is actually free for viewing at this web address, $0. You can read the entire report. And I'll summarize some key things for you. Again, there are drugs they don't know good or bad. They just do what they do. And some humans benefit and some humans don't. So there are some benefits there are some benefits to marijuana. In the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine analysis, these are the ones that had the strongest support: pain, nausea, spasms from multiple sclerosis, another form of pain, and so forth, and actually pretty narrow sleep disturbances in obstructive sleep apnea, but not other kinds of sleep disturbances. Of all the conditions that have been reported in the National Academies analyses, these were the ones that had either conclusive evidence, meaning strong evidence from randomized controlled trials, in other words, very good studies, to support the conclusion. So these are very strong evidence, and moderate evidence is definitely worth mentioning, because this means some support that to conclude that they're beneficial. So there are benefits, but surprisingly, of all the, we go back to the state of Illinois, 40, 38, 21, National Academies analysis only found like 6, and some of those are redundant: multiple sclerosis, and so forth. So the states are are certainly more optimistic than the National Academies were in terms of potentially beneficial, in terms of conditions likely to benefit. And risks. So these, in the eyes of National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, were supported by substantial evidence as credible risks associated with cannabis. If you smoke it, you can wind up with lung problems like bronchitis. Certainly, there's an increased risk of motor vehicle accidents. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about prenatal or about use of cannabis during pregnancy, but women who use cannabis during pregnancy give birth to babies. They have a substantially elevated risk of giving birth to babies that are 5 pounds or less at the time of delivery. There's a whole world of concerning data on cannabis use in pregnancy, notably development of schizophrenia or other psychoses. A whole bunch of analysis has been done about this, and the average of all the studies would say that people who use cannabis regularly are at about 400% higher risk of developing a schizophrenia diagnosis later on in their life. And problematic cannabis use, if we define this as substance use disorder or addiction, then estimates run between 8% to 10% of people who use cannabis will wind up with a substance use problem. However, if somebody begins using cannabis in their teenage years, that risk is about 20% that they'll have a substance use disorder within 3 years of initial exposure. So constant message is that the problems and the risks are much, much higher when cannabis is initiated during teen years or during early adulthood. So these are the ones with substantial evidence. And I think it's also worth looking at the ones that National Academy said were supported by moderate evidence. Moderate evidence means several supportive findings from good to fair quality studies with, notably, very few or zero credible opposing findings. So, I was always taught first, do no harm. And if one is considering to use cannabis, or if one is a state government, thinking about making it open, these are some things you might also want to consider putting on the warning label, because they are, if you wind up with suicidal ideation or attempts, that's a super bad thing. And there is very few or no credible opposing findings to say that this association is meaningless. So for our purposes of mental health effects, you have memory and learning problems, bipolar association, people who use cannabis. Let's see if amongst people with bipolar disorder, those who use cannabis had a significantly earlier age of onset of symptoms. Amongst people with bipolar disorder, those who use cannabis have more mood disturbances, more episodes of mania, more episodes of depression, have a stronger likelihood of going into the hospital because of that. And they also have a higher risk of suicide attempts. Increasing risk of depressive disorders, similar to the bipolar thing. Suicidality is definitely increased, especially if cannabis use has begun during adolescence. And anxiety disorder and worsening of symptoms of schizophrenia. Interestingly, there is moderate concern that a person who uses cannabis can eventually develop another substance use disorder like cocaine, for example, or alcohol or something like that. So these are, in the time I have left, I can't spend huge amounts of time talking about all of these, but suffice it to say that a very credible scientific organization without skin in the game, like, they're not going to benefit from legalization and they're not going to be paid for making alarmist statements, have said these are risks worth noting and considering. So how is one drug able to cause all that potential risk? Well, I'm going to tell you about how that works. And as I said, the thing that makes any medicine useful is exactly the same thing that makes any medicine potentially dangerous. So let me start off by showing you some pictures. Here is dopamine. You've probably heard about dopamine. It's a neurotransmitter. Our brain uses it in circuits that mediate reward or motivation. This is basically the chemical shape of dopamine. Here we have amphetamine, which you've also probably heard about. Amphetamine is actually a spectacularly useful medicine for people for certain kinds of conditions like attention deficit disorder, lethargy, or apathy associated with brain injury, and is not infrequently, it's sometimes useful in cases of depression as well. So it has a lot of really important medical uses, but amphetamine also is well known to produce psychosis, anxiety, and a host of other, and addiction. So it can be a source of problems. But take a look. This is the shape of dopamine. This is the shape of amphetamine. You see, they're extremely similar. The only thing missing are these oxygen-hydrogen groups from this side of the molecule, and this hydrogen has been replaced by that carbon-hydrogen constellation. Very similar thing. And that's how drugs work. Drugs are chemicals with shapes like natural chemicals, and the way they're shaped allows them access to the machinery of life, to the molecules that make living possible. And that's what makes them possibly useful and possibly dangerous at the exact same time. If an illness causes your, let's go back to dopamine, if some kind of, say, genetic condition makes your brain poorly able to make dopamine, then perturbing the system by giving this one to sort of mimic that one can be exceptionally useful. But again, if your brain makes adequate dopamine, or if you're a person who's just very sensitive to dopamine, then adding a whole bunch of that is going to lead to a problem. So that's why benefits and risks come. There's two sides of the same coin. And that's, some people, as I say, react badly to having their systems perturbed by drugs. The other thing happens is that if you take a drug regularly, like if you take amphetamine regularly for ADHD, or if you use cannabis regularly for whatever you want to use it for, daily or regular exposure to any drug, therapeutic or otherwise, I see this as kind of like a chemical pressure. There's a constant extra chemical force pressing on the biochemical system, and the body is designed to repel outside forces because the body wants to work within its, its decision about, the body wants to work within the parameters that it feels it was best designed for. So if cells or systems of cells see that there's this outside chemical that's perturbing the system is going to change to fight against the outside pressure. And that internal change can also be a setup for problems. And so this is where this shouldn't come as a surprise to people who study pharmacology, but I do think it's kind of pervasive that we think that benefits are in one bucket and risks are in another bucket, and they're very separate, and actually they're deeply intertwined. So let's now try to look at what exactly cannabis is doing in the body so that we can understand how those various mental health risks can come about. Cannabis is a plant. That plant basically is just a mixture of chemicals that form into all sorts of different interesting structures and colors. And about 500 chemicals exist within the cannabis plant. About 80 of them are relatively unique to the cannabis family of plants. And one of them, THC, which stands for tetrahydrocannabidiol, is the thing that makes cannabis more interesting to human beings than broccoli. In other words, THC is what gives a sense of euphoria or a sense of interesting perceptual disturbance. It's what people use it for, and what people generally breed cannabis for is higher levels of THC, and most consumers are really interested in THC. There are some exceptions, but as a general rule, THC is what gives cannabis its buzz. The other ingredient that is really important that you've probably heard about is CBD. It stands for cannabidiol, which sounds like cannabis, and so it can lead to some people think that CBD is like a form of cannabis. It's not. It's just another chemical in that plant. CBD does not produce euphoria, does not produce high. It for most people produces no perceptible subjective effect. There are possibilities that if you have something like a high level of anxiety, that having CBD come in might relieve anxiety. That's a kind of a maybe supposition right now. But by itself, CBD for most people is not an interesting, they don't notice it. And so when we talk about the pharmacology of cannabis from going forward, we're going to talk about the actions of THC, because that's what people are after generally. So THC is shaped like this. This is another way of viewing how the molecule looks to the body. And this is a chemical called anandamide. So THC is what the cannabis plants make, and anandamide is what our brain cells make. And you can see they're very similar in shape. And so the body is going to respond to THC as if it was anandamide. Interesting. That's what makes THC work for people. The reason why you wind up feeling buzzed or euphoric or maybe paranoid from THC is because when we use extra THC from plants, we flood the system. There's just so much more signal coming from this molecule than we would have ever gotten from the natural one. And the natural molecule, our body has a way to break it down really rapidly after it's been released, and THC is not destroyed by that system. So anandamide is a very short-lived signal. It's released and then it's broken up into pieces very rapidly. THC lives forever. Once it's in the system, it's going to stick around for a really long time. So you wind up with higher levels of signal with much longer time. So it's an unnatural stimulation of the system, which then makes it, interesting or potentially risky. So that's the molecule. The other thing I want to talk about so that you become an expert in understanding cannabis pharmacology is a thing called CB1 receptor. CB1 receptor is a special protein. It's kind of like an antenna that's designed to detect chemical signals, specific chemical signals. So the CB1 receptor is designed to detect anandamide. And this figure is represented by these like open hexagons. They're labeled cannabinoids for reasons that are too detailed to get into. But in the brain, when it says cannabinoids, it's anandamide. And so generally, when the presynaptic, which means the one that's sending a message, sends the message to the receiving cell, postsynaptic, then the receiving cell creates anandamide, which then floats around and lands on the CB1 receptor. Of course, there'll be some over here too. And this basically completes a loop. So the sending cell has sent a chemical message, receiving cell has gotten the message, and it's now more or less active. And it sends out this little signal to say, hey, got the message here. And that generally means that this cell, once it's detected that its message got across, will shut down for a while. You don't need to keep flooding the system if the message has been received. So the purpose of anandamide generally is to tell the sending cell, we got the message, you can be quiet now. That's great. And the other important point, THC is shaped very much like anandamide and activates that same receptor and does the same thing, but longer and stronger. All right, so that's that. And those receptors, those CB1 receptors, are located in a lot of super important brain real estate. In a different analysis, I counted 14 different brain regions that have high concentrations of CB1 receptor, meaning 14 different regions of the brain that can easily detect and respond to THC from cannabis. This is a simpler figure, but cerebral cortex is where we do our thinking and our planning and our perceiving. Caudate nucleus is responsible for some control of impulses and also for reward sensations. Hippocampus is for memory. Hypothalamus is for stress response and temperature and appetite. And for our purposes down the road, amygdala. Just remember this word, amygdala is located about there, where my pointer is. Amygdala is super important. It's like the anxiety detector. It's the structure that assigns threat to something that comes up and will turn on the panic machinery. So the basic point here, lots of brain regions, lots of chemicals, leads to lots of interesting actions, including some that aren't pleasant. And just to go back to this, this is like the sending cell. This is the receiving cell. And this could be any number of different chemical packages. The chemicals most notably affected by THC are glutamate, whose release is decreased, GABA, whose release is decreased, dopamine, which is interesting because in short-term exposure, dopamine levels go up, but with long-term use, dopamine levels go down. And then serotonin, long-term use of cannabis or THC suppresses serotonin release. So there's certainly more, but these are the major players in terms of importance in chemical communication, and they're also very important in mental health effects, as I will now illustrate. Glutamate. A lot of people have not heard about glutamate. You will learn more about it as time goes on, because we're learning in pharmacology, we're learning more ways to successfully interact with this very complicated system. It is the #1 neurotransmitter. If you look at all the connections, the synapses in the brain where chemical messaging occurs, half of those connections use glutamate as a chemical signal. So in terms of the number of connections that utilize that signal, it is #1. Half the brain uses, or half the connections in the brain use that signal. Glutamate universally is an excitatory signal. When the cell receives glutamate, it becomes more likely to be active, or it becomes frankly active. And THC universally suppresses the glutamate release. So glutamate is no longer able to be released. Glutamate is a driving force. So stopping glutamate through THC is like taking the foot off the gas pedal, and it's a profound effect. That's probably why it's probably why the cannabis can have so many different effects for so many people, because glutamate is involved in so many processes. Among those important processes are memory and brain development. Oh, sorry, this is not supposed to be here. This is a leftover from a previous slide. Among the actions of glutamate are memory and brain development, which is super interesting, because if you're disrupting glutamate from THC, that could account for those cognitive effects that we mentioned. And the disruption of brain growth and development may explain why youth who use cannabis regularly are much more prone to problems with cannabis, because it's interfering with the development of their brain, which is very active at that age. And also, glutamate, if you block glutamate signals, that's a really good way to give people a side effect that looks a lot like psychosis. And if THC reduces glutamate release, that's very similar to that well-described psychosis production pathway. Really interesting study published in 2019 showed people in the laboratory, normal volunteers without a history of mental illness, were given intravenous THC and put into a brain scanner, which could measure glutamate levels in the brain. And then they noticed that, the majority of people who got the THC did not wind up with psychosis. Some of them did. And the ones that experienced psychosis from THC in the laboratory, and by the way, Morgan Fox, that's some proof that shows that THC causes psychosis in an actual laboratory. But the ones that developed psychosis had the highest baseline output of glutamate release and had the biggest glutamate inhibition response. So we actually caught these guys, Kalitsi and colleagues, caught psychosis in the act, and it was revolving around glutamate signals in the THC experiment. So glutamate, very important target for THC and the source of a lot of potential mental health effects. GABA. Glutamate was #1, GABA is #2. In the synapses, or the chemical connections within the brain, 30% or 40% utilize GABA as a signal. So that's a huge number of connections, and it's an extremely important signal. Glutamate was like the accelerator, the gas pedal. When cells got glutamate, they become more active. GABA is the opposite. GABA is like the brake. When GABA is released, the receiving cell becomes quiet, and THC inhibits GABA release. So that's like taking the foot off the brake. So people who use cannabis wind up reducing their output of glutamate and reducing the output of GABA, which becomes very complicated because you're taking the foot off the gas pedal and the brake. And then what's going to happen? It depends upon whether a particular brain region was, gas pedaling or braking at the time. That's why THC effects are so complicated to work out, because everybody's different and there are all different regions, and some are on gas and some are on brake. So that's why that happens. But GABA is extraordinarily important in anxiety. The best drugs to relieve anxiety all work by accentuating GABA release. So they, it's like pressing on the brake. The best medicines are activating the GABA brake. Cannabis-induced panic or anxiety, and you saw 20% or more experience that probably happens because of taking the foot off the brake in the amygdala. So the amygdala is that anxiety center. If the person's amygdala is using GABA to keep it under control, and THC comes in and stops the GABA release, then it's taken the brake off of the anxiety engine, and then that explains panic attacks. And that, this hypothesis here is actually borne out by laboratory studies, really cool imaging studies, where they look at these CB receptors in the amygdala, and they find people who are going to experience panic attacks are the ones that have the highest level of CB receptors. So that means that their amygdala are just more responsive to this anti-braking action of THC. So that's how that can happen, and that can explain why some people find it to be anxiety relieving, because those people did not have the brake active in the amygdala, and why some people find it utterly panic-inducing, because those people had their amygdala with the brake was on before the THC came in. Dopamine, I'm sure you've all heard about that. Dopamine is basically a reward or motivation molecule. It's involved in circuits that mediate those two functions. And cannabis, short-term use, immediate release, absolutely causes dopamine to be released, which can account for why it has an addictive quality, why it has a pleasant quality, and why it may actually produce paranoia or psychosis, because we also know that like inhibiting glutamate, goosing or stimulating dopamine is another good way to cause paranoia or hallucinations. And with long-term use, dopamine levels decline, dopamine release goes down, and if you're then losing a motivation or reward molecule, then life becomes uninteresting and one loses one's motivation. So that may account why we see higher rates of depression or apathy in cannabis users over the long term. And serotonin, again, most people have heard about serotonin. A lot of the anti-anxiety and antidepressant drugs are designed to enhance serotonin signal. Serotonin is related to mood, anxiety, and aggression. And concerningly, in animals where we give drugs to constantly activate that CB1 receptor, those animals after long-term use do not make serotonin. I mean, they make very little serotonin, and they that's a recipe for like depression or mood changes. And that may account for this relationship between cannabis use and higher risks of depression and suicide. And also in a not too long ago study published 2018 from Washington State University, a naturalistic study looking at actual medical marijuana users rating their mood before and after using cannabis. The app was called Strain Print, and they had thousands and thousands of data points. They found that during use or shortly after use, there was an elevation of mood. But as the users were followed over the course of months or a year or more, most people had worsening depression over time. So that is maybe related to the depletion of serotonin synthesis activity. So that's that. So the bottom line is that there's a lot of different regions of the brain that are receptive to THC, and THC can do a lot of chemical changes. And the combination of a lot of brain regions and a lot of chemical effects means that you have the potential for a lot of potential therapeutic gains. It'll be tricky because it's a very complicated system, but if you can work it out well enough, there is a lot of potential benefit to harnessing the power of cannabis or cannabinoid chemicals. But at the same time, that combination of lots of brain regions and lots of chemicals creates a lot of risks. So cannabis is really tricky. And I showed you the data at the beginning. About 20% of people try it once and they're done. About a quarter of people try it once and they love it. And a lot of people are in between. So people are different. There's a lot of different effects of cannabis, but the bottom line is that it has definitely potential to interact with mental health in unfavorable or risky ways, particularly for people who are otherwise vulnerable. So thanks very much. Here is me, and you can, find me online and, follow along. I when I have time, I post stuff, various channels, and you can see what I'm thinking about in the future. So I'm going to stop the share now, and we'll open up for questions, I suppose.
So we do have a couple questions in the chat, and thank you so much, Dr. Messamore, for a very informative lecture. I'm sure we all found it very interesting. I did. So here we go. What is considered moderate use? How often is 1 milliliter, 7 milligrams each of THC and CBD tincture drops under the tongue?
A professor of mine from college said, how long is a piece of string? And so when it comes to moderate use, this is a very subjective term, and it's not one that it's difficult to quantify. So it's kind of like saying, how much alcohol is moderate? Different people have different definitions. So I can't really say what's considered moderate. I take a guess. Moderate would probably be more than once in a while. And moderate probably is like, not super often, and probably also defined by not feeling out of control in one's use. And 7 milligrams, 1 milliliter, 7 milligrams of THC and CBD. Okay, well, 7 milligrams of THC is kind of a lot. THC is a legitimate, the THC is a medicine that any doctor can prescribe in the United States. So it's kind of weird because cannabis is totally illegal on a federal level, but THC by itself, I can prescribe it, and I have prescribed it occasionally in my practice. If you read the prescribing information for THC, it's going to say start at 2.5 milligrams and work up to 5 milligrams, and maybe not more than, I can't remember if it's 10 milligrams. But essentially, when we use THC medicinally for its indicated purposes, which are to treat nausea related to chemotherapy, or wasting or appetite disturbance related to HIV infection, then like 2.5 to 10 milligrams is the on-label medicinal range. And so 7 milligrams is like it's a pharmaceutical dose. CBD is really interesting drug because I would say nobody actually has a clear idea what CBD does or how it does what it does. If you look to the receptors it interacts with, you can certainly see it interacts with, say, like serotonin signaling, but the concentration of CBD required to knock on those serotonin receptors is just huge. And that probably explains why in the pharmaceutical studies, when CBD is used pharmaceutically, like the approved use to treat certain kinds of epilepsy, its dose is 400 to 800 milligrams a day. I follow the literature on the use of CBD as a possible treatment for schizophrenia, and those studies also utilize CBD at doses, starting dose of 200 milligrams a day, working up to about 800 milligrams a day. So, 400, 800 milligrams is the dose. If there's going to be if there's going to be a psychotropic action of CBD, in the research that shows it, it's usually many hundreds of milligrams per day. So 7 milligrams of CBD is trivial compared to the CBD doses that are typically studied in clinical research. So that's the answer to that dosing question.
We have 5 minutes, so we'll try to get through a few more of these questions. After prolonged use of cannabis, how difficult is it for the brain to return back to natural function, if at all possible?
Well, that's a good question. There's a thing called cannabis withdrawal syndrome, or cannabinoid withdrawal syndrome. It's been well described. It's in the DSM. And it's kind of like the opposite of what cannabis does. So cannabis tends to relieve anxiety, promote sleep. During withdrawal syndrome, people will be more anxious, more irritable, sleep less. Sometimes will have nausea and so forth. It's the typical duration of the withdrawal syndrome is a couple of weeks. Although there are reports of people who had used very extensively, for a very long time at very high doses, and it can last several months of noticeable discomfort. I have, among the things that I pay attention to is a syndrome called Candaminoid hyperemesis syndrome. This happens to a subset of people who use cannabis regularly over the long term. As I said in the talk, they will start to develop episodes of extreme vomiting. It comes like in cycles or waves. So they'll have a day or a week of vomiting, like, 7 times per hour or more frequently. It's really, really, really awful. And the only solution to that seems to be to stop using cannabis. So I actually follow along groups on Facebook of cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome sufferers and read their discussions. And, on average, they're back to normal within a few months, although most people say that they can never really go back to using cannabis again because it starts to get the vomiting comes back almost immediately. So it leads to the possibility that there is a long-term sensitization of some circuits in the brain to at least some adverse effects. And I guess what I'm saying is that there's like zero hard data from well-designed scientific studies, but from anecdote or from consumer report, it seems a rare but possible thing that some of the changes in the brain might be very, very long-term. But in general, the average user can have much better overall function within a month. And on that topic as well, it's really, really common for people who use cannabis to wind up with kind of a dysphoric mood and sleep problems. They usually use cannabis to try to treat mood and sleep problems. But then it became very gradual that things got worse. And it's extremely common that people are surprised when they finally get done with withdrawal, they're sleeping better than they have ever, and their mood is better. So for the majority of people who stop using it, I try to say, try to give it a break for a month and see what happens, because by a month, most people are out of withdrawal and feeling much better.
We should have time for one more question. My 25-year-old son has schizophrenia. He's on Seroquel and Zyprexa. He claims cannabis helps his anxiety and reduces his audio and visual hallucinations. He's currently using Delta-8 THC. Do some people with schizophrenia benefit from THC? He does use cannabis at a young age.
When it pertains to human beings, and the question is it possible? The answer is always going to be yes, because we as human beings are incredibly diverse individuals, and there's always some exceptions to the rule. But if you look at the scientific studies, the overwhelming majority of people with psychosis wind up getting worse from THC. It's possible that there is some benefit, but if I'm advising my patients, I try to say, let's figure out, what benefits you're getting, and in this case, hallucinations and anxiety, and see if there's some way we can do this with medicines that are easier to get, that your insurance will pay for, and that are not associated with the kinds of risks that are fairly well documented from THC. But the big problem for everything is that there are like zero data to help predict what are the long-term consequences from regular cannabis use. I mentioned one of them, cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, and I spend some time reading blogs from like websites like Weed Maps or there's a couple of pro cannabis websites, and they have a lot of blogs that I read. And on pro cannabis websites, there are discussions about this phenomenon where a person can use cannabis regularly for many years, and then like all of a sudden they have really bad anxiety. That's that thing I was talking about with the body fighting back against chemical pressure. So if you have a drug that is anxiety relieving, the body's going to fight back to sort of like up its game on anxiety production. And the possibility exists that the body will win and become, much more anxious. And that seems to be what these articles on Weed Maps and so forth are describing, like this new onset bad anxiety where they never had anxiety before. So the long term, in the short term, it's great, and one hopes that the greatness can continue forever. But there's this always risk that the body will fight back and then produce difficulties later on.
We will be closing the meeting at this time. If you have a question for Dr. Messamore, you can write me using the Cures Foundation website, and if Dr. Messamore is busy, I can get you a reply from another doctor. Thank you for joining us. Again, tonight was sponsored by Cures on Campus Clubs. Please feel free to write the Cures Foundation if you have any interest in establishing your own club or joining other virtual meetings like this. If you're interested, the Cures Foundation is always seeking donations. If you'd like to donate, thanks to the presentation tonight, we'd welcome you to do that. And thank you again to Dr. Messamore for such an interesting presentation. So, good night.
All right. Thanks, everybody.